Hey y'all, so recently Lily Alexandre uploaded a video about how apparently feminists are becoming far right, and it was okay. I have pretty low standards for trans activist content, so I'm mostly thinking not about did the video convince me, but just things like, did the video stick to the topic and at least make some actual arguments. But yeah, a while ago I made a video about my languishing enthusiasm for responding to content on YouTube, and Lily Alexandre was my primary reference for that. Of course, while I'm not doing response videos on my main channel, I have actually been doing weekly reaction videos on my Patreon and Subscribestar. So if you'd like access to that content, you are of course welcome to give on either of those sites, and you can get a response video every single week. Wow! And of course, a big thank you to all the people who support me financially on Patreon and Subscribestar and make this channel possible. You're very much appreciated. But I think I've been wanting to feel more creatively fulfilled by this channel, and part of that has been breaking out from that response video thing where I just did the same format for every single video, and it got kind of boring. So while I'm going to respond to Lily Alexandre here, I'm going to break with tradition by doing a format I've never done before, and it's a format that I've derisively in the past characterized as heckling. Basically playing a short clip of Lily speaking and then responding to it relatively quickly and just working sequentially through the video in that way. I'm not sure how this is going to play out, but like I say, I just felt like doing something different. So with all that said, I'd like to present my response to Lily Alexandre on the idea that feminists are becoming far right.
There is no world in which this collaboration makes sense.
Okay, right out the gate, it's not a collaboration, it's overwhelmingly just people doing their own thing, tolerating each other.
We're often met with thought-terminating responses like, well, they were always conservative. And that's not entirely wrong.
It's not really true at all. Most gender criticals have a documented history as bona fide progressives. I can't really think of any example at all of a gender critical person who used to be a conservative. Most of them belonged to left-wing parties and were, at least in some way, active in various kind of left-wing progressive movements.
Now, the people in charge barely identify as feminists at all.
Yeah, sort of. I mean, the gender critical movement has become more about disagreeing with trans identity generally, so it's not as if it's necessarily got fewer feminists inside it, it's just that the movement itself has become more popular, and therefore the proportion of feminists has gone significantly down.
But I haven't heard anyone talk in depth about why it's happening, or how this is impacting the political opinions on either side.
Well, for the record, a lot of people have been talking about this. It's just those people have been gender critical, and they've not come to the conclusion that the gender critical movement is wrong or sinister based on this, so you might not be interested in what they've concluded. Over 2 years ago, I made a 2-part video elaborating in extensive detail on why there might be some overlap between the gender critical movement and the conservative right, and you are welcome to check that video out, but just in case you want a quick summary, here are the main reasons I give for why the gender critical movement might have some apparent or even actual overlap with the conservative right. Number one, because a lot of progressive sources don't report on news that would present trans identity in a bad light, lots of gender critical people basically have to go to conservative sources if they want to see the whole story, and therefore they will be more exposed to conservative opinions. Since being pro-trans is a mainstream progressive belief, anybody who's gender critical is going to be more willing to disagree with other aspects of the progressive left because they've already shown some willingness to disagree based on having rejected trans identity. Since most gender criticals are progressive, they're going to have broadly progressive friend groups where they might not be as comfortable expressing the areas where they disagree with the progressive, left on some points. And therefore, when they get into gender critical spaces, that might be the only opportunity where they can be reasonably sure that they're not going to face too much judgment or backlash for expressing all the areas where they maybe do agree with the conservatives on some points and disagree with the progressive left. So because the gender critical space is the only space where they can be reasonably assured there won't be any judgment, because of course it's filled with people who have disagreed with the progressive left on at least some issues, that's going to be the place where you see those ideas more prominently expressed. And of course, outside of gender critical spaces, gender critical people are going to be more used to having rocked the boat when it comes to having opinions that are slightly more conservative, or maybe kind of, comments that are slightly more edgy. So because they've already rocked the boat, they don't really have anything to lose, whereas someone who already signs off on all the progressive left talking points, including trans identity, they are going to have a lot more to lose if they say something controversial. If I say something controversial or like not 100% in lockstep with the progressive left tomorrow on Twitter, I'm not going to have a whole load of people saying, how could you say this, blah, 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 because they know that I don't agree with the mainstream progressive left on every single point. By contrast, if your typical trans activist says something that is expressing disagreement on some issue of immigration or, criminal justice reform or whatever, with the progressive left, they're likely to get much more backlash because their fans aren't going to be used to the idea of them disagreeing with the mainstream progressive left. Since most gender criticals have changed their beliefs on something major, because most gender criticals used to be trans affirming, they are going to be more accepting of the idea that people can change their opinion, and therefore they're likely to talk to conservatives a lot more. So you might see more kind of dialogue between gender criticals and conservatives, because as a gender critical progressive, I know that I've changed my opinions on some stuff because I used to be trans affirming. So if I know I've changed my opinions on some stuff and then I saw that through reason and logic and arguments and evidence, I could change my opinion, I'm much more willing to talk to conservatives because I'm anticipating that people can change their minds. Whereas if you're a progressive left person who's just always believe what the kind of mainstream progressive left opinions are, you're going to be less inclined to imagine that people can change their opinion and just think of it as like, you believe what you believe and other people believe what they believe, so you're not going to talk to the conservatives as much. And finally, since gender criticals have changed their opinion on something, it's likely that they will have then thought, well, do I have any other beliefs that are wrong? And therefore they're going to have interrogated their own beliefs. When I found out that, or realized that trans identity doesn't make any sense, I then thought, well, I've believed trans identity was correct for years, but now I've suddenly found out it doesn't make any sense. I need to think critically about my other beliefs. And the consequence of that is, in having thought critically about my other beliefs, I'm now more confident in the truth of those beliefs because I've thought them through. And therefore I'm more confident in talking to conservatives because on the points I disagree with them, I'm now much more confident in knowing why I disagree with them. By contrast, if you're someone who's never ever thought critically about trans identity, and if you're someone who affirms trans identity, chances are very low that you have thought critically about it, then you haven't possibly thought critically about any of your other beliefs. So you're going to be resistant to talking to conservatives based on that. So there we go. Those are 6 reasons why I think gender criticals are more likely to talk to conservatives, more likely to express conservative sounding views, and even might be more likely to actually have conservative views. But none of those reasons suggest anything sinister. They're basically all pretty much just extensions of the fact that if you are a gender critical person, you are departing from the mainstream progressive left on one point. And basically, by extension of departing from the mainstream progressive left on that one point, you're then likely to do all those other things that all kind of broadly relate to being more willing to go outside of just what the progressive left says.
Why did feminists, conservatives, and fascists decide to form a coalition?
It's not a coalition. Coalition implies something way more substantial than just a bunch of people who agree on the same thing, agreeing on it. Although I will say now, I want to give Lily credit for actually recognizing that gender critical people are feminists. That is something that most trans activists don't do, so I will give Lily credit for being honest there.
They were all united by being strongly anti-gender and opposing anything they thought naturalized the connection between biology and destiny.
Oh wow, more credit. Yeah, well done for recognizing that the gender critical movement is, in some fundamental sense, at least at its inception, about opposing gender and gender stereotypes and the kind of naturalization of those stereotypes.
I often see them taking positions I find horrible for reasons I pretty much agree with.
Wow, so you're admitting there is an important distinction between agreeing with somebody's position and agreeing with somebody's reasoning for that position. So the same way there's an important distinction between me thinking that trans identity isn't valid because it's a claim about reality that I don't believe has been sufficiently evidenced, and somebody else, say, being against trans identity because of some anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, or because they think it goes against some kind of pure notion of being a proper masculine man or something like that.
How can J.K. Rowling call herself a feminist while earning praise from Vladimir Putin?
You literally just acknowledged that it's possible to disagree with somebody's position, but agree with their reasoning for that position. Does it not also follow that the inverse is true, and that just because Putin might agree with J.K. Rowling's position on trans identity, it doesn't therefore follow that it's for the same reason, especially when you consider the fact that J.K. Rowling is notoriously your very typical kind of Western neoliberal, while Putin is basically the arch rival of people like that.
The gender critical movement and mainstream conservatism cater to people who, like one Abraham Simpson,
used to be with it, but then they changed what it was. Now what I'm with isn't it, and what's it seems weird and scary to me.
Well, let's say this is true. It would be true in any case where an established truth comes to be disregarded by contemporary society. If the entirety of society decided that 2 + 2 = 5, or at least the majority of society decided that, then I guess the people pushing back and saying 2 + 2 = 4 would be representing those who used to be with it and are now past it, but that doesn't mean that they're wrong.
This reaction aims to turn them from passive acceptors of the status quo into staunch defenders of the status quo. If you think the world is more or less all right for women, if the feminist project has been completed...
Okay, let me just stop you there. Who said that the world is mostly all right for women? That's not a mainstream gender-critical position. It's certainly not mainstream amongst gender-critical feminists specifically.
I can't help but feel like I am the one who's actually critical of gender, and modern gender criticals are pretty crazy about it.
One issue here is that you haven't defined gender critical, so one could say that the term gender critical means, by definition, being critical of gender. Now, I think it can be defined more broadly to basically mean opposition to the idea specifically that gender roles and gender expression and gender identity can cause you to be a man or woman with no regard to the reality of your biological sex. And obviously in that broad sense, you are going to get people who aren't against gender more generally. But it's also worth noting, by the way, that people can just be hypocrites in any movement. So I'm not going to deny that there might be people who are nominally gender critical and even kind of ideologically should be committed to the gender critical position. But then when it comes to their actual reality, they are hypocritical on that point because, like I say, people can be hypocrites.
Gender criticals love describing trans people as lifelong medical patients who drain so many public resources that we're just not worth the trouble.
I've never heard anybody talk about this issue in terms of draining our precious economic resources. Usually it's expressed in terms of the potential danger for trans-identified people because we can't guarantee that the medical establishment will always be able to take care of them. And in general, being a lifelong medical patient is just not something that's going to be a happy state of affairs for anyone. It's not about conserving economic resources, and if that was my main concern, there are many, many things that I would ban before medical transition. My main concern is just that I don't want kids to take Lupron and then have their bones destroyed and have to be a lifelong medical patient because they've got constant chronic pain from the arthritis that's been caused.
And that means reducing or keeping down the number of people who transition. Every one of those people is basically, a huge problem to a sane world. Like if you've got people that, and whether they're transitioned, whether they're happily transitioned, whether they're unhappily transitioned, whether they're detransitioned, if you've got people who've dissociated from their sex in some way, every one of those people is someone who needs special accommodation in a sane world where we re-acknowledge the truth of sex.
There's no indication that Joyce's main concern here is economic either. You later on include this little statement in post. I want to underscore that in her view, transition wouldn't be happening anymore, so the bothersome accommodations she's alluding to aren't subsidized HRT or surgery, they're probably conversion therapy. I don't think that's an accurate reading at all. I'd say a surface level reading is if somebody has become incredibly invested in this idea of trans identity being accurate, and that's including physically investing themselves as well as mentally investing themselves. What are we going to do when people realize that trans identity doesn't actually make any sense? How are we going to help those people in a way that maximizes their happiness and capacity to flourish? I don't think we should just leave those people out on their own in the way that the trans community does for detransitioners. Basically the trans community says, hey, if you become detrans, you're out on your own. A lot of the time people who detransition completely lose all of their support network because a lot of their friends and people they kind of got to know were all trans. All of their kind of doctors who they were talking to were interested in helping them with transition. So when they instead say, hey, I want to move away from this stuff, the trans community and all the friends they had, the support groups they had there, don't want to help them out with that mentally. All the doctors are saying, no, I only know how to pump you full of wrong sex hormones. I don't know what to do in terms of helping you with recovering from what in fact was a bad thing for you. A woman who takes testosterone and then finds that her vocal cords have been completely destroyed and needs like speech therapy and things like that, she's out on her own. That's basically how the trans movement reacts to detransitioners. I don't think that's how we should treat anybody. The funny thing is that far from the gender critical movement being all about conserving our precious economic resources by not helping people too much, I think most gender critical people would say, hey, you know, if it costs a bit more money, that's fine. The most important thing is making sure everybody gets the help they need. And of course, the big difference is for gender critical people, that includes detransitioners who, by the way, you know, that's the other thing. Lily mentions conversion therapy. Conversion therapy just means therapy that affirms your biological sex, that helps you to recognize that you don't need to deny your biological sex. And insofar as that's what conversion therapy is, which is, let's be honest, what it is, yeah, that's another thing that we can do to help these people. And of course, should be funded by the state, the same way all therapy should be funded by the state. But yeah, especially therapy that's going to help people be happy and flourish and be content with recognizing reality as it is.
If we're asking why radical feminists would ally with the least feminist forces on Earth, there's one answer. Many of them are bigots who started identifying as feminists, not the other way around.
I feel like this is totally untrue. I mean, look, obviously I was never a bigot. J.K. Rowling was never uncomplicatedly unproblematic, but it's pretty brazen to suggest that she was ever a bigot. Graham Linehan got involved in women's fights for reproductive rights in Regular Island, and obviously was involved in kind of Gamergate as far as opposing it and opposing the a lot of the misogynistic abuse that was coming out of the Gamergate movement. And kellie-jay Keen was somebody who basically initially thought that the gender critical movement was wrong and that basically trans identity is valid, when of course I think actually almost every single person I mentioned there, certainly including me, initially thought trans identity was valid, which obviously I don't think that's related to bigotry, but if someone's trans affirming, they would probably think that's related to bigotry. By contrast, I just can't think of any example of anyone who you could point to clearly and say, this person was a bigot and then they became gender critical. I can't think of any example of that. I like, the thing is, I'm sure it exists, and if someone's able to find an example of that, then well done them. But I personally can't think of any example. Again, J.K. Rowling, she, had some kind of stereotypical names for some, characters who weren't white. Okay, that's not bigotry though, is it? Like, that's the thing. Unless you, like, the people who do that, they have to take these really uncharitable readings of things, which in no other context would they say, oh, this person's a bigot. They're just saying it, like, they're interpreting things in the worst possible light because, again, they want to argue that only a bigot could become gender critical for optical reasons.
I started writing this video because I was curious why the Canadian right has adopted a transphobic agenda pretty much out of nowhere.
The conservative right have always been transphobic in the West. I mean, obviously there are exceptions, like the especially binary trans people, like, for example, Blair White, who basically, through trans identity, actually, in some sense, reaffirm a lot of the stereotypes, kind of traditional ideas about man and woman. And of course, there are the homophobic people who view transition as good insofar as it allows them to refuse to acknowledge that they in fact have a gay son or a lesbian daughter. So there are exceptions. But generally speaking, the conservative right, of course, have not been flying the trans flag. And that's not something that's changed. It's just something that's getting more focused now because that's kind of how politics works. You have news cycles and things like that. Right now in the UK, the trans thing is pretty big, but, so's all those migrants crossing the channel in their small boats and everyone's talking about, are you going to stop the boats? That's not because suddenly conservatives are against immigration. And that we need to think, well, why have the conservatives suddenly become against immigration? No, they were always against immigration. It's just now that's an issue in the news. So they're talking about that now more so than in the past.
A key name to know here is Redux, a self-described radical feminist blog that follows the Daily Stormer handbook to the letter. They're so devoted to their daily stories about trans criminals that they haven't published anything else in almost a year.
What's actually wrong with that, though? Because, your side is the side that's basically said, hey, this whole idea that trans people are criminals and, going to sexually assault and things like that, it's a completely illegitimate concern. And therefore you shouldn't be concerned about trans-identified males in women's prisons, in women's changing rooms, so on and so forth. If that's the argument you're going to play, you've kind of necessitated that the people who want to call you out on your nonsense are going to benefit from having a website that collects together all of the examples that contradict you. Like, how can you basically make the argument be such that that thing existing to contradict you is necessary and then complain that that thing exists?
The idea that trans people should be protected has grown deeply suspicious to some segment of the population. Like, why should our lives get better if theirs are getting worse?
Most gender critical people aren't opposed to the idea of trans people's lives getting better. Also, I think most gender critical people don't think trans people's lives are getting better. I mean, in terms of reasons to oppose trans ideology, there are things like women having their private spaces taken away, women basically not getting the opportunities that they're supposed to be especially afforded, for example, in women's only leagues and things like that. The idea of womanhood itself becoming meaningless, such that we can't really talk about feminism or misogyny or patriarchy anymore. Sexuality becoming completely meaningless because, we can't talk about gay men being attracted to biological males anymore. Gender non-conforming people being completely sidelined because now people only kind of conceive of gender non-conformity in terms of trans identity. So for the individuals who want to be gender conforming or gender non-conforming while recognizing the reality of their biological sex, they're left on the sidelines. Detransitioners, as I've already mentioned, get completely ignored. Children being basically encouraged, let's say, I'm not going to say forced, but encouraged to do a lot of this stuff when they're really not young enough to be able to make these decisions. Individuals of particular races being scapegoated, where people will argue that if you deny that biological males can be women, then that's equivalent to denying that black women can be women, which is, of course, an incredibly offensive thing to say. Issues relating to free speech, the fact that people should be able to say, hey, you've made this claim about reality that biological males can be women, but I don't think you've evidenced that, so I disagree with it. That's considered something that in a lot of contexts you're just not allowed to say. But apart from all those reasons, another reason why you might be opposed to trans activism is because you think actually trans identity, it's kind of a delusion, or at least I don't see any evidence for it being accurate, and therefore I don't think people can meaningfully get long-term happiness from the affirmation of a delusion. So no, I don't think it's improving the lives of trans-identified individuals. I'm not opposed to trans-identified individuals' lives getting better as long as, one, their lives actually are getting better, and two, it's not to a significant extent at the expense of any other group's rights.
But even theoretically progressive parties like the UK's Labour have veered right on trans issues to not appear overly bleeding heart.
This gets to one of the fundamental issues of this analysis. It's inevitably going to be simplistic because you have to be simplistic if you want to reach a conclusion so simplistic as gender criticals agree with the right and therefore they're wrong and evil. In this case, the nuance is completely brushed over as to how Labour came to be led by Keir Starmer. Labour was led by Jeremy Corbyn, who was one of the most left-wing leaders of a major political party since possibly Michael Foot. But that was bad for the establishment elite because he wanted to redistribute the wealth. He wanted to give the working man a fair share and a fair shake. And he basically wanted to make the people who've been kind of looting this country to enrich themselves face some kind of consequences, or at least that's the idealized view of what he was aspiring to, and certainly it was enough to scare the establishment elite. So obviously they wanted to replace him with a neoliberal shill who was going to play ball. So they got rid of Corbyn and they replaced him with Keir Starmer. And Keir Starmer has no values at all. He has no aspirations. He has no personality. He is just a scummy man who will do anything he can to get his slimy, slick little tendrils on power, including saying anything and everything on every single issue as long as he thinks it will please somebody. and get people to vote him into power. To act as if it's just as simple as, well, Labour was a left-wing party, and then transphobia happened, and now even Labour are saying transphobic stuff. You're completely ignoring the actual reason why Labour are saying the things that they're saying right now, which is that they're a bunch of scummy liars who are just saying a load of stuff that they think will get them elected, and then of course once they get in charge they're not actually going to do any of it, they're just going to funnel money up to the establishment elites who they really serve. Now in contrast, there are some genuinely left-wing parties who are pushing back against Labour and pushing back against the establishment elite, and one of these parties is the Workers' Party, which is led by George Galloway, who is gender critical. So this just isn't a left versus right thing, and this can't be more obvious than when you look at the UK.
But rarely do they come out and say, I think it's the Jews. Who specifically they blame is modular enough that versions of this theory can circulate in Tablet magazine, a right-wing Jewish publication, or be regurgitated by Bari Weiss, who is herself Jewish.
I sort of hate this because it's acting as if Jews are like idiots who can just get duped into accidentally promoting anti-Semitism, when I'd suggest what it really is that Jews are intelligent enough to recognize that just because something might superficially resemble the rhetoric of anti-Semitism doesn't mean it is anti-Semitic. This is especially important right now when you look at what's happening in Gaza. The reality is that a lot of Jews are against what's happening in Gaza. Obviously, you had that speech at the Oscars. But of course, a lot of the criticism around Israel, especially kind of, influence, for example, that Israel has in Western countries, does superficially resemble some of the rhetoric of anti-Semitism. And I'm sure a lot of anti-Semites would echo a lot of the sentiment from some of the people who criticize Israel. But does that mean that all the Jews who also think there are problems with Israel have all been duped into accepting anti-Semitism because they're all idiots and morons? No, it means they're able to recognize that just because you disagree with Israel on some point, or just because you say things that might line up with what some anti-Semites are saying, that doesn't mean that a viewpoint is automatically anti-Semitic. I honestly can't believe the mainstream progressive left are still pushing this anti-Semitism point with what's going on in Israel, because most people on the mainstream progressive left have criticisms of Israel, and they must be aware that there's pretty much no way you can express those criticisms that won't in some way parallel anti-Semitism, right? So they must realize that anybody can turn this around on them and say, well, hold a minute, you're saying something that looks kind of like anti-Semitism, so that must mean you're an anti-Semite. They must realize they're walking into that trap, but they're still continuing to set up that trap for people they disagree with, saying, well, what you're saying kind of looks like anti-Semitism, so you're an anti-Semite. And, the fact that some Jews have agreed with what you're saying proves that those Jews are idiots who've been tricked into accepting an anti-Semitic narrative. And it's like, no, people can just believe things that might seem similar to bad things, but doesn't mean they're bad things.
On the most moderate end, you can think being trans is real, but a mental illness. The trans people are trying to force the world to change instead of bettering ourselves. A little further out, you can think that the media is behind it. They make money off the attention we get, so they're promoting us widely. A little further out, you can believe trans rights are funded by the medical establishment to make money off of surgeries. Further out, you can think that trans people are the result of pollution messing with kids' hormones or DNA. Even further than that, you can think trans people are a sex cult, demanding rights only as a means to groom more children. And all the way out at the absolute extreme, you can believe all of the previous ones, and that the Jewish elites are transing white children to sterilize them and put an end to the Aryan race.
I mean, yeah, you can believe those things. So what, right? Like, you can believe good things, and you can believe bad things. Saying, like, listing some things you can believe that I would argue are good, for example, the kind of more moderate stuff there is something I would definitely agree with. But then saying, and also you can believe bad thing. Okay, yeah, sure, you can do that for anything, right? You can believe that 2 + 2 = 4, or you can believe that the earth is flat. Yes, correct. You can believe correct things, and you can believe wrong things, or even evil things. What are you proving there?
In 2019, she strongly condemned Wolf and Posey Parker for their choice to work with the Christian right. But by 2023, Posey Parker's star had risen substantially, and I guess Bindle decided to get with the program. So when Parker came under fire for allowing this to happen at one of her rallies,
hey, you're worried about us! Fuck you, Nazi! Fuck you!
Bindle had nothing negative to say.
This is, like, slanderous. I mean, there's no reason to think that Bindle is just a clout chaser who's suddenly abandoned all her criticisms of Kellie-Jay Keen. It seems much more likely she's just recognized that this whole, like, oh, Nazis showed up to rally, it's not a good criticism. I mean, I have criticisms of Kellie-Jay Keen, but that Nazis showed up to a rally is not one of those criticisms because it's not a good criticism. Even if my list of grievances against Kellie-Jay Keen grew to this massive list, I just reached the point where I was like, I really am fundamentally opposed to this person, I still wouldn't put Nazis showed up to one of the rallies she organized as one of the items on that list because that's not a legitimate grievance, right? Like, if you organize a fight or a march for a good thing and Nazis happen to show up to it, what is that? How is that actually a criticism?
We know at least some gender criticals have at least some kind of moral compass that would normally lead them to believe things like Nazis are bad and I don't want to be around Nazis. And yet, despite any reservations they may hold, despite any concerns they've voiced previously, they are in the same movement. How do they reconcile that?
I care more about whether a belief is right or wrong, not whether or not Nazis agree with it.
Feminist says what you believe in. Gender critical only says that you don't believe.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I think the gender critical movement has become kind of a nebulous concept now, to the point you could kind of question whether or not it really exists. Like, I'll say for my part, nowadays I don't really view myself to be in relation to a wider movement. I just view myself to be someone on YouTube who is interested in discovering truth and discovering whether or not, specifically, the claim that a biological male can be a woman or a biological female can be a man or, non-binary and all that kind of stuff, whether or not that is a true statement about reality. And that puts me in agreement with some people is true. It puts me in agreement with some people I really like and really agree with and think are awesome. It puts me in agreement with some people I think have some really bad ideas and are terrible. But that's kind of how I view it at this point. Mostly when I, sit down to make a video, I'm like, yeah, I'm going to just look at the arguments, look at the evidence, explore some interesting ideas, but not necessarily advance the cause of any coherent movement at this point. And I think in a way that's kind of a good thing, because it's basically the reason why I don't think it's necessarily as much of a movement now is because it's become so popular that lots of people all over the place are now realizing that this idea of biological male is a woman or could be a woman doesn't make much sense. So that's kind of a good thing. Like, I really care about transport infrastructure. My great uncle was one of the kind of early kind of main theorists around transport infrastructure, and he wrote a lot of books about it. And even now, when I watch some of the video essays around transport infrastructure that I find so interesting, I will see people mention some of the ideas that he initially theorized. Also, my granddad was the guy who came up with where the yellow line should be at the train station so you don't get sucked into the train. So transport infrastructure interest runs through my blood, and I love talking about it. But I don't consider myself to be part of like a movement. I'm not part of like the 15-minute cities movement or the don't build another lane, you idiot. That doesn't actually reduce the amount of traffic because it just makes the community less welcoming to pedestrians and therefore forces more people to drive, which only makes the problem even worse. Movement. I just like talking about it. I like talking about the theories behind transport infrastructure, what works, evidence-based policies, case studies, things like that. It's exciting. And it's kind of the same with the gender critical movement or lack thereof. Gender critical ideas. There's so many different questions, so many different opinions people have, different strategies, things like that. If you try to, fit it into a movement, it kind of gets boring when it's much more interesting to just view it as all sorts of different collections of questions and ideas and examples and all policies and things like that. That's kind of how I'm viewing it now. I feel kind of more free to explore it more honestly and openly when I just say, well, it's, it's a series of questions. And that's exciting.
This is why some transphobes were calling themselves gender atheists a few years back, which I honestly wish they would bring back because it's so transparently uncool.
Wow, Rebel of Empires called out. He's the only person I know who uses the phrase gender atheist.
That's true about just about every genre of anti-trans activist, really. They straight up won't tell you what they believe.
Wow, that seems the opposite to the truth. I mean, honestly, I struggle to believe that there are very many trans-identified individuals or kind of trans activists who have let any gender-critical person talk long enough that they could meaningfully claim to know whether gender-critical people will actually tell you what they believe. But I would say, no, most gender-critical people are quite forthcoming about what they believe when they're given the opportunity. And by contrast, of course, trans activists, their whole thing is claiming that biological males can be women, biological females can be men, you can be non-binary, and yet when you try to pin them down on what any of this means, they can't tell you anything substantial, so it seems like this is projection. The gender-critical people generally have a pretty clear idea of here's what we believe, this is why we believe it, these are the implications of what we believe, and it is the trans activists who are the ones who basically say, here's what we believe, but let's not really talk about what we believe or the implications of that.
Collaborating with them never helps the original cause because fascists don't show up to help.
A good thing we're not expecting them to help. Yeah, we know that the fascists are basically just cynical grifters who are latching onto a movement that they happen to agree with because they know it gives them prominence. We know that's kind of what we've been saying they've been doing this whole time. It's basically begging the question to say, hey, did you know that the fascists aren't actually going to help you with your movement, and collaborating with them and putting all your hopes in them coming to save you is not a good idea because they're only out for themselves? The issue of saying that is that you're implying that gender-critical people ever thought anything other than that, when we don't. I mean, the mainstream gender-critical position seems to be that pretty much the fascists should just be ignored. That's my opinion. I'm not convinced a biological male can be a woman, again, and all the other things. I'm not going to name it every single time, and the non-binary and the trans man and all that kind of stuff. But I'm not convinced a biological male can be a woman. Well, let's just broaden it. I'm not convinced of the claims trans identity makes about reality. That's inescapable. Or it's inescapable absent me suddenly encountering a good argument for why trans identity is actually accurate, which I've not yet encountered. So absent having encountered that, I can't pretend to believe something that I've not been convinced is true. So I don't believe trans identity is accurate. If I chose to show up to a rally to basically say, hey, make my voice heard, hey, I don't believe trans identity is accurate. If a bunch of Nazis show up and say, we also don't believe trans identity is accurate, what's that got to do with me? Why do I care? I'll just ignore them, right? No, you're not allowed to agree with me at this rally about this point on which we agree. Why not? Right? Screw them, obviously, get rid of them generally. But as far as them being at this particular rally, well, they agree with the rally's point. Not my business. I'm not taking it upon myself to get rid of Nazis. I'm not the Soviet Union.
Kellie-Jay Keen, obviously a far-right infiltrator.
This strongly suggests you know nothing about Kellie-Jay Keen. She, as I've already mentioned, as you actually give Sean a shout out in this video, which I've not included because I don't think it matters, but you give Sean a shout out. Sean has documented that Kellie-Jay Keen was at one point trans affirming and viewed kind of anti-trans feminism with suspicion. Kellie-Jay Keen was a member, or not necessarily a member, but a supporter of the Labour Party, which obviously, like I say, has not been entirely reliably left-wing, but it's certainly not conservative. There doesn't seem to be any evidence to suggest that Kellie-Jay Keen was a right-wing personality from the start who entered the gender-critical movement with the specific goal of corrupting it and bringing it down from the inside, or basically infiltrating it, as you say.
The anti-trans movement will never succeed. Fascism, by its own construction, has no win state.
I disagree with this. I think if we abolish the Gender Recognition Act and we make it so people can't be sterilized below the age of 25, and we normalize the usage of sex-accurate pronouns, then I've won, or we've won. I'm calling that a win. I'm saying that's a win. And only the last of those is kind of nebulous, in that you could say, well, what does it mean? And basically what it means is that we reach a point where me saying, hey, maybe some people agree with trans identity, but I personally disagree with it and I think it's inaccurate. That should be no more controversial than an atheist, for example, saying they don't believe in God, that they think that a religion is inaccurate. I actually think there's potentially a point where I will put my feet up when it comes to this YouTube channel. I mean, look, I don't anticipate ever wanting to stop doing kind of what I do here, where I do commentary online, but I could see a point where I'm like, hey, mission accomplished as far as I'm concerned. I'm happy with where we're at in terms of advancing the gender critical position, and I'm willing to move on from it and start focusing on my true passion, transport infrastructure. Anyway, I'd like to end with a challenge for anybody watching this video. Can you formulate an argument against the gender critical movement? I mean, an argument starting with the premise that Nazis agree with the gender critical movement. So I'll give you, okay, we got premise one. I'll give you premise one. Premise one is that Nazis are opposed to trans activism and believe that trans identity is inaccurate. There we go. That's it. I am giving you premise one. Now, the conclusion you have to get to is, therefore, the gender critical movement is wrong. Right? So okay, you've got premise one. I'm giving you that. I'm giving you the conclusion. All you need to do now, potentially, maybe you can just do it in one premise. Premise two. What is it? What are you going for to substantiate the logical deduction that therefore the gender critical movement is wrong, right? Because I mean, trans activists, they're always talking about this, right? Hey, Nazis agree with you, Nazis agree with you. They're talking about it all the time. So surely they have an argument, right? Like surely there is some argument against the gender critical movement that starts with Nazis agree with you. Otherwise, why would they be talking about Nazis agreeing with us so much? Anyway, so that's the end of the video. Yeah, that final point there is something I really wanted to get to, because it's funny. They talk about it so much, like, oh, the Nazis shot up around you. It's like, okay, you're saying this. So what's the actual argument, right? The argument that says, okay, therefore the gender critical movement is wrong, because I feel like I must have blinked and missed it. But I thought that it would be a fun way to end this and to kind of cap off me talking about this particular video from Lily Alexandre. It's supposed to be how far right the gender critical movement is. Anyway, I hope you like this video. Please do like, share, comment, subscribe, and of course give on Patreon and unsubscribe to that if you would like to. And of course, yes, then you will get to see some more reaction content that is in a similar vein to this. So thank you for watching. See you next week.